4 of them. I'll be happy. Can you explain what you mean by controlled opposition in the context of contemporary political movements and protests? How does this concept manifest in today's social and political climate? And I believe when you're talking about this, you're talking about it more from the U.S. aspect.
I would say it's a phenomenon that pertains to what we call liberal democracies, or what I prefer to call managed democracies.
Okay.
But um,
And what do you mean
liberal
by managed
democracies, yeah.
democracies?
I think U.S. is just the case I focus on because it's the one that people can most relate to and understand, because that's just due to the amount of inhabitants.
Hmm.
But I started studying the subject mainly because there's a lot of talk about controlled opposition, right, as a concept, and I wanted to study what the actual literature that existed, what it had to say on it, and it's
And you
pretty
went to the
it's very limited.
you went to the Frankfurt School route. You looked up the Marcuse.
Yeah, well, that was, no, I wasn't a Marcuse like way before that.
Okay.
But
Oh,
I mean,
sorry.
like controlled opposition, right? It's a thing that we hear, and
Uh-huh.
it's pretty mainstream to talk about controlled opposition in the likes of Russia. I mean, Adam Curtis in the documentary um,
Hypernormalization.
Hypernormalization. Yeah, yeah. He talks about Putin backing different protest groups against each other. And you have some people on the left on the very fringe, like you have this book called Who Paid the Piper, which is about the CIA Congress of Cultural Freedom, which talks about how certain side of left academics and journalists were backed by this group that was getting funding from the CIA. And I don't really like these narratives that much, because not to say that they don't have a kernel of truth, I
Mhm.
don't think it really explains what happens in our societies as far as opposition goes, and why it's so limited and
Mhm.
very tranquil. But so, like, the theory that I push in the video called controlled opposition, a theory. I use controlled opposition more for search engine optimization, to be honest, because the whole point of the video is really saying that um, what we have going on is not controlled opposition. We have something more akin to contained opposition. And I guess that's something of an important point of clarification, because control implies that it's being directed by a party or an apparatus,
Mhm.
and the actions are actually, directed from somewhere. Whereas contained is to hold something within a confine, within a set of limits. Contained opposition isn't directed by anybody. It can be uh, influenced, pushed a certain way. It can be caused by certain things, but contained opposition becomes contained by itself and due to structural forces. Now, that's a kind of sounds like a just jargon there, but I'll go deeper into what I mean. And first, I do want to say
Mhm.
why I said this was a theory in the first place, because what I really wanted to do is I was looking desperately to see if anyone else had written a theory about this, so that I could just say it was theirs, or just push it to something so it would be more legitimate.
Mhm.
You know, that's usually in academia. If you want to push a certain theory, it sells a lot well. It sells a lot more effectively if you say, "Oh, well, Foucault came up with this, and I just got it from
Gotcha.
Foucault," or you just attach it to some big name. Thing is, I studied a lot of different theories, and there were theorists who understood what I'm talking about, and they had this understanding of power that was nuanced and explained the same phenomenon, like Zizek, and I talk about him in the
Okay.
video, and this idea of inherent transgression. But he doesn't actually flesh it into political theory that's specific at all, in terms of something that actually explains institutions and protests, and that isn't just vague. Thing about Zizek, it's really a psychoanalytic phenomenon he explains, whereby um, people essentially will transgress a law that is too heavily enforced,
Mhm.
and people are going to transgress the law no matter what. So actually, a more effective solution is to take the permissive, liberal parent approach, as opposed to the strict parent approach where you lay down the iron law. That kind of intensifies it. I guess the simple way to put it is like in Victorian England, everyone was fucking.
Mhm.
That didn't stop anybody. The church didn't stop anybody. But you have a system that allows for a degree of dissent. Now, applying this logic to protest, um, it is really hard to boil down. But the video called "Controlled Opposition: A Theory"
Mhm.
goes over it,
Mhm.
and that video is basically a more shortened down version of what is a more in-depth argument that I make in my dissertation, my master's dissertation from a couple of years ago, a year ago now, and I basically flesh this out even more in my upcoming book that I have with Revel Press, which I know you're collaborating with
Mhm.
Mike Watson. It's
Mhm.
called "Liberal Totalitarianism: The Spectrum of Managed Democracy and What Makes the U.S. Different." I added that as a sort of end extra section of my dissertation that it was the most speculative part in the sense that it's the hardest thing to prove empirically, but it's more of a theory. I
Mhm.
call it the a tentative theory for a reason. Like it's something that I want other people to add to. I want people smarter than myself to research and develop into something more robust. I added that because I felt this was the main thing that Sheldon Wallen, the guy who I built on
Yes.
his theory of managed democracy, I felt like that was what he was missing because he always ends his analysis with this idea of fugitive democracy. He thinks modern democracy is heavily limited in what is capable, and what you really have open as a space is these moments of fugitive democracy, these ephemeral revolts, expressions of popular will, grievances of the unheard. He tends to kind of like fetishize this, and I really thought like, well, what is fugitive democracy? Like, how do you tell these days what is fugitive democracy? What is political revolt that actually seriously can disrupt the system, and what isn't? So that's what got me thinking. I started thinking of protests is not an exception to the rule of hegemony, but a part of that rule of hegemony. That it's an expression of a stronger power that allows for a certain degree of protests. Basically, that is how I first started thinking about it. And also to think of liberalism not just as a set of ideals, political ideals tied to a program, but as a style of governance. Um, you have you have the tradition of realist thinkers who think this way. Like, of course, Machiavelli's very famous for that. But there's two things I was trying to do. I was trying to show that the reason you have rights that the purpose that rights serve in liberal democracy,
Mhm.
the function, the objective function, irrespective of like the rulers of that system, the function that it serves, it's not just like a system of free contestation where different political actors can voice their opinions and compete for political power. Now, to you, that's probably obvious that this isn't true because you've heard all the Marxist perspectives which critique liberal democracy and all that. To a lot
Mhm.
of the audience, this will probably be obvious. To a lot of liberals, it is totally not.
Mhm.
Um, now, why I don't think I don't deny the Marxist perspective. I think they're pretty much correct in most of the critique of liberal democracy. It just doesn't it's not it doesn't explain a lot of modern phenomena. I'm trying to just explain the specificity of
When you
liberalism
talk
as
about
a system of control.